actually doing cable laterals yesterday, and I thought back to just like some examples of classes I've been in where, they're maybe testing shoulder range of motion, let's say inflection, where your arm's going overhead, whether it be on a table or whether people are just sitting in class and it's just like, okay, raise your hand. How far, can you make your arm go, over your head? And there's, multiple things again, when we're talking about range of motion that can make a hand go higher.
Mhm.
So I can get that from a shoulder. I can get that, from a shoulder blade. I can get that from a rib cage. There are lots of things that can change that appearance. And then again, when we come into the weight room, as you mentioned, the resistance can really change how far you can get into that range as well. And, I just think about, again, those things that bring us into that appearance of hand going overhead. And when I'm doing a lateral raise, I really get this sensation that like more of that motion seems to be coming from the shoulder versus say the scapula. And I could be wrong. Like I'm interested, in your thoughts on that. But I get that like I raise my arm as if, I'm not trying to go as high as possible, but I'm really just trying to move at the shoulder. If I started off with the intention of how high can I get my arm, I
Mhm.
would coordinate that exercise very differently. And I think when bodybuilders talk about, how to make people feel lateral raises, they give exercises and descriptions that are things like reach outwards, push, stand in a doorway, push out against a doorway. And it seems to me like a lot of that motion, is coming more as like a glenohumeral, like shoulder motion versus a how high can I get the appearance of my hand motion. And I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about, where does that motion of getting your hand overhead come from and how might that influence the goal of specifically loading the middle delt?
I think a good place to start here is just from the standpoint of understanding that the middle delt specifically attaches from the side of the shoulder blade to the upper arm. So what that means is that when it shortens, it will pull the shoulder blade to the arm and it will pull the arm to the shoulder blade. Now you don't really see, you don't really see the shoulder blade being pulled to the arm because we have muscles that prevent that directly. What we usually see is just motion of the arm, like in a lateral raise. So when the upper arm is moving, you know that 100% of that motion, if you're in a very specific middle delt sort of exercise, when just the arm is moving, you know that the middle delt is doing the bulk of the work, right? Because it's anchored somewhere else and it's attached to the arm, so it can pull the arm up. But once we start to get, we'll say, toward like 90 degrees of having our arm out to our side or sort of out to our side and in front of us, all these other things start to move in the scapula and the clavicle specifically. So to our conversation earlier about spine motion, and I'm getting deeper into leg press because my spine is sort of rounding under me like a dog taking a shit. The sort of equivalent to this, and not that it's good or bad, right? But in the context of training the middle delt, when my scapula and my clavicle start to move a lot, what is doing the moving of those bones is not the middle delt, right? Is all these supporting tissues, traps, levator, serratus, right? All those guys. And so the distinction really between what we'll say is as a greater range of motion lateral raise and a partial range of motion lateral raise is not so much the difference between more middle delt because more range versus less middle delt because less range. It's more like, yeah, still we have a good amount of middle delt in this like quote full range of motion lateral raise, but we have a lot of other stuff that's associated with that motion, and that actually may limit and often does limit the ability to actually, we'll say, get through that full range. So we can think of the full range of motion lateral as this like really sort of omni blended exercise of like, you got a lot of delts going on there, you got a lot of traps going on there, you got a lot of serratus stuff going on there. But you have a lot of stuff that might prevent, again, people from feeling like their limiter is in their middle delt. And experientially, that tends to be what I see a lot is people just feeling like they're blasting their traps with any kind of lateral raise. So Then we sort of get to the what we're calling the partial range, or where we're I think the cue of like move your arms out to the sides or like reach for the walls, those kinds of cues come from. Those cues are simply just cues to limit range going overhead, right? Because if your brain is thinking like I need to move my arm in this horizontal direction, it's not going to try to coordinate any vertical motion along with you changing the direction. And so when people do that thing or have that intention to reach to the wall, they are in essence just moving sort of within the territory of where the middle delt is actually going to do the most amount of work per the total range. So, from 0 degrees of raising my arm to about 90, it's pretty much like pure middle delt, and all those other muscles have a very low demand to support the shoulder joint. But from 90 degrees above, we have a ton of involvement, which mostly comes from muscles that move the scapula and that move the clavicle. And again, which isn't to say that all of a sudden your middle delt recruitment drops off the face of the earth, but as a proportion of muscle recruitment, you have basically a drastically lower amount of middle delt involvement in that top half of the range as compared to the bottom. So when we're considering what kinds of directions to load our arm, and we have in theory an unlimited amount of options in terms of the implements that we can use, I'm going to prefer to use an implement that can directly load the bottom half of the range, like a cable or like a machine that is built to do that, as opposed to a dumbbell, where the dumbbell really only starts to pick up its degree of loading where those other tissues start to become more involved, right? So why do so many people have this issue of like dumbbell laterals in their traps? It's like, it's just your body's and your brain's solution to the physics of the exercise. It has nothing to do with your lack of mind muscle connection or anything like that. It's just simply what is being called upon to manage that range at that particular point in the exercise. So there was, yeah, go ahead.
It seems like the follow up to that oftentimes is like, well, if we can get middle delts and we can get traps and we can get levator and we can get, serratus, like more is better.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to like what a counter to that might be?
Yeah, I would just say that, there's no situation in which you get more of something without getting less of something else. Like it's just this game of like of trade-offs that you're playing. And in my experience, like traps are something that are pretty much I mean, not pretty much. They, from a physical scenario standpoint, they are impossible to get rid of in any upper body exercise. So if you don't need more of any muscle group, it's probably it's probably traps and levator, which are holding your shoulders to your body 100% of the day, all day, every day. But just in terms of like because I do hear that presented a lot of like, well, if I could just get more of everything, then what would be the purpose of getting more of this specific thing and less of the others? And I would say, well, number one, like if it's your goal to get more of this one thing and less of the others, like many people say, like, oh, my goal with this exercise is to train my middle delt, then moving away from that to me is moving away from the aim. It's moving away from the goal. And in addition, what I would say is, if you are again getting more of those other muscles that you mentioned, by definition you are getting less of a degree of recruitment in middle delt, and as a consequence you're also potentially starting to overlap the stimulus of what you're doing with other things that you're applying that same logic to, right? Which may end up not only being redundant from a stimulus perspective, but also sort of counter to what an efficient program might look like. And when I say efficient, I just mean sort of easier to organize, in the sense of like, I know if I'm doing this one thing and I know that this is the primary stimulus of this one thing, I also know that it's not the primary stimulus in this other activity, which may have previously, if I wasn't thinking about it, overlapped a ton, right? And then you start to get into situations where people are like, XYZ feels like shit all the time. I feel like XYZ isn't recovered every time I train it, like those kinds of issues. And yeah, middle delt, interestingly, I think not so coincidentally, is one of those muscles that people like really lack a mind muscle to. And they'll use logic like, oh, it's because it's a single joint, or oh, it's because it doesn't cross multiple joints. And I think that's wrong.